Hi there, welcome to GrainTV. It's Tuesday, December 29th. We had an up day in the markets. Let's take a look at the grain hedge trading platform and see where we closed. In Chicago, wheat was the leader to the upside, gaining 9.25 cents, beans up 5, and corn up 1.5. Today's news was pretty light, but the main factor driving the markets today, especially in wheat, was the case of flooding in the Midwest. We've had a lot of rains that are starting to lead to some pretty serious problems in the Illinois and Missouri area. The Mississippi River has now been closed thanks to the flooding problems around St. Louis. So that is somewhat getting the market excited. I think it's still a little too early to get overly excited about this flooding problem. But if the flooding persists and causes those wheat crops to be underground or underwater for about a week or so, then that potentially could do some damage. Other news today, we continue to watch the South American crop forecasts and the weather conditions, and those weather conditions continue to point to better rains in northern Brazil, a drying trend in southern Brazil, and Argentina continues to see fairly ideal growing conditions. So overall, no real change in the outlook there. The trend last month was a dry northern part of Brazil, a wet southern part of Brazil, and as we go into January, the forecasts are calling for those regions to sort of flip-flop, where the north gets a little more moisture and the south gets a little less moisture, which is again ideal for growing conditions down there. Speaking of weather, some of the meteorologists are starting to point to what we might expect in the coming growing season in the US, and they're really starting to focus in on a couple of years as analog years for the El Nino situation. And so, as most of you know, El Nino is very strong and present this year, and so weather forecasters are looking at comparable years in historical terms of what we are seeing this winter, this November-December period, and what that might allude to in the coming growing season for the U.S. crops. Take a look at these maps here that we have from World Weather Intelligence, and basically you can see the wet periods that we've been talking about in the Midwest over the last 60 days, especially in that Illinois, Missouri, Southern Plains area. Very, very high moisture levels compared to normal. That is pretty consistent with with El Nino events going back to 1982 and 1991. So if you look at the maps for 1982, again, very wet conditions a little further east than we're seeing this year, but again, very wet in that area in that November-December period, and again in 1991. Now, what the meteorologists are telling us is that when we see these conditions associated with a strong El Nino, we tend to have these wet conditions carry forward into the spring planting season. And then there is the potential to have a dry up in the summer. And the question is the dry up going to be sufficiently timed to cause problems for the corn and bean crop, or is it going to be sort of later in the season after the crop's already been made? But let's take these years and just sort of look at what yields have been. So if we're looking at the 80s and the 90s in these particular El Nino event years, what do we see in terms of yields? Let's start first with the negative news, and that's wheat. In both of these years, these El Nino years in the 1980s and 1990s, we saw better than trend line yields because, again, we're coming in with a wet spring, which is obviously positive for the winter wheat crop. And so in 1983's crop, we saw a 15% better than normal yield, and in 1992 we saw about a 6% better than normal yield. Now with corn and beans, it gets a little more dicey because, again, the question becomes, will the weather turn dry during the critical growing season, or will it prolong itself until the end of the growing season? And that's where we're a little bit different here. In the early 80s, in 1983, that event happened to be a dry, coming off of a wet spring and a very dry summer, which led to a big loss in corn yields. In 1992, it was actually later in the season, so it didn't affect, and actually we had a really good yield for corn. And soybeans, similar situation. 1980s, we saw a below normal yield by a substantial margin. 1990s, we saw a better than normal yield. So the question is, with these two comparable years, which one are weather forecasters leaning to as comparable to this year? If you're rooting for higher prices, the good news is it's probably more like the 1980s. And again, this is a weather forecaster's perspective on this. There's a lot yet to be determined, but they seem to be hanging their hats on this year's weather events being similar to 1982, 1983, and if that's the case, then that spells some positive price potential for corn and beans this summer if we do see that dryness kick in. So that's what we got today on GrainTV. If you got any questions, give us a call, 877-472-4607, and always visit us online at grainhedge.com.